Abstract 45. My name is Mohammed Ranin, for those who know me, all of you know me. And Dean of School of Business Law and Social Sciences. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this lecture by Professor Nicholas Grier. Before we gives his presentation, always there is this introductory thing about what is Abstract 45. It is basically an event to showcase our research carried by our professors, colleagues, which has been produced over the years. And also, some of you know that this is the 30th anniversary for Abertay University. And we like to remember that by having this research and having all these activities from now until the summer. So, since Abertay became a university, we have changed the way we work. So, from being a teaching-driven institution to teaching, research, and outreach, collaboration, impact, and many other things. And Abertay basically has been transformed, and transformed by the people who worked very hard for it. And today, I think just I'd like in this occasion to remember the former principal, Bernard King, who passed away last week. And today, some of us attended his funeral. Professor Bernard King, he transformed Abertay University. He worked tirelessly to make sure that it moves on from being a teaching institution, a polytechnic, to a world-known university for its research, for its teaching, for its interdisciplinary teaching, which we feel proud of. And this is shown in the recent Research Excellence exercise, which we have improved in all areas of research. And our research continues from strength to strength. At the same time, our teaching as well. While we are proud, we are top 10 in teaching satisfaction. Research now is equally important, the same as teaching. And this is why we have this series, which we like to show to our colleagues to share our research, as well as to the world, what we do. I think we do a lot of things. And our research is not really having an impact on the local community. It has a worldwide impact on the economy, on society, and many people refer to Abertay now as a university which has a lot of things to offer. Many people ask me, before we talk about law, they say to me, what do you do at Abertay? And I say to them, I am Dean of School of Business Law and Social Sciences. And they say, you must be a great lawyer. Yeah? I say, no, I have nothing to do with law, really. And I contribute to creating some great lawyers. That's what we have. And the only thing I know about law is you have to have three things, and all of them are above your neck. No heart, no feeling. And possibly, Professor Nicholas Grier will tell me later that I am wrong. Three things. Number one is a good tongue, the gift of the gab. If you speak well, you use the right words in the right place, and you turn what is right into wrong, what is wrong into right, and you convincingly, that's number one. Number two, you have a good memory. You memorize things. You memorize all the acts of parliament or whatever, all the articles, memorize what people have said to you, you memorize the lies and the truths, and you have to be good at it. Number three, for a great lawyer, which I know, this is my description in fact, is that you have to have stern face no smile, no emotions. And you talk to people, if they are a winning case, you have won the case, okay, that's good. Madam Sir, sign above the dot line, that's 600 pounds for the hour, 100 pounds a minute. The case has been lost. There are no emotions as well. Sir, madam, sign above dotted line, and you get to pay. And also, even when you buy property, you are happy, really, you are going to have a roof above your head, you're excited, and so on, and the solicitor will say, I think you should write your will. They reminded you that you are not going to enjoy staying in this property. You are going to go away. Somebody will enjoy it, so you are going to die. So, and still you have to pay for buying it, and they remind you you have to pay when you write your will, and somebody will take it all off from you. And there are many things as well in there. So that's really my humble description of what the lawyers do, so I cannot be taken seriously. However, I know the man who can, and that's Professor Nicholas Grier. Professor Nicholas Grier was educated at Oxford University. He read English. We say that it's a posh word for studying Oxford. Yeah, and then he read law at Edinburgh University before becoming a solicitor, Scottish solicitor, and he worked in a number of firms, including a merchant bank. After many years of contributing, and hopefully he wasn't one of the people I described earlier, and he's a cheerful man, it's okay. So he decided, I do something different. And he moved into academia. He went to Napier University as a lecturer and then as a head of a school, as a head of the law school. His contribution was significant in improving the student satisfaction, and after a number of years, instead of deciding I'm going to put my feet up and enjoy my retirement, he came to Abertay. He started a new career in academia. He joined us about 10 years ago as part-time professor of law. Then he became a full-time head of division of law, then a part-time professor of law. At that time, he contributed immensely and significantly to the school's growth and development. And above all, his contribution to teaching excellence. He has been an excellent lecturer who all the students love him. Possibly like a daddy love him, because he tells them stories, same as the one I told you earlier, but still, he is excellent lecturer. He wins every year. Every year he wins a prize, student wins, for his excellence in teaching. And also his academic work. He has written many papers in relation to insolvency, bankruptcy, employment contract, company contract, and also textbook, and which is in his 5th edition and is sold worldwide. He tells me he still makes a little bit of money out of it. Yeah? And that contribution also has made a lot of impact in teaching and learning because his book is used as a textbook in his field. And also he advises a number of committees and the Advisors Bureau, Citizens Advisors Bureau regularly, and he is a member of a number of societies and so on, which I didn't bother to look into, but they are here somewhere. Yeah. I think chair of the Banking Insolvency Company Law Reform Subcommittee, Law Society of Scotland, as well as the advisor of the Scottish Parliament during the passage of the Bankruptcy and Diligence, etc., Scottish Act 2007, and many other things. So it has made great contribution to the legal system of Scotland and to the University of Abertay over the last 10 years or so. And also I'd like to tell you that he is clever because he was selected to be in the University Challenge in 1982. So in 1982, and he was a member of the Edinburgh University team on the University Challenge alongside his 3 fellow law student peers, and they narrowly got there, but they were beaten by Queen's University Belfast. Well done. What's important is the contribution, really. Yeah. And the participation. Without continuing further, ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you Professor Nicholas Grier.
Is that it on? Do I need to hold this?
No, you have to cut the slides off.
Okay. Thank you very much for that embarrassing introduction. I'm glad to say not all of it was true, but there we are. It was particularly nice of you to mention the fact that when I was at Napier, we did very well. We came twice. We came top as student satisfaction with our law school. And I thought it was worth pointing out to you that this is actually what has happened this year for the Abertay Law School, which I think deserves a wider audience. So I guess these things just follow me around. But there we go. Now, thank you very much for all of you for turning up this evening. Particularly, I particularly appreciate my students turning up, and indeed all the mobile phones that go off. And I appreciate all the members of court who've come. I believe you've been hard at it all afternoon deciding whether David is respectable or not. I don't know what the ultimate decision was. And I know it's been a long afternoon, so I'm touched that you're taking the trouble to be here. Now, I've managed to get away with not giving this professorial lecture for 7 years, which I think is a considerable accomplishment. And they finally caught up with me, so let's see how it goes. So I have various things to tell you. First of all, company law is an exceptionally dry subject. There's no getting around it. It's so dry that it makes the sandy dunes of the Kalahari Desert seem much like the sultry mangroves of the Mississippi Delta. It really is a very, very dry and arid subject. And it's so dry that I thought it would benefit from a joke. So in the course of this lecture, there will be a joke. And I'll give you plenty of notice of it so that you can enjoy it. And it is not a rib-cracking joke. It's not a dad joke. It is a subtle and intellectual joke, such as members of court will thoroughly appreciate. And it would appeal to the mandarins on Yes Minister. It's that sort of a joke. So I hope you're going to be ready for it. I'll give you due warning. Other things that I need to get out to begin with are that company law assumes that capitalism is the dominant economic system. So if any of you happen to be Marxist-Leninists, I suggest you leave now, because you might find this wasn't wholly satisfactory. And a further little point that I've just noticed talking of shares is that some of you are drinking BrewDog stuff. Isn't that correct? Some of you have got BrewDog. And I'm absolutely delighted you're doing so, because I happen to be a shareholder in BrewDog. So thank you very much. You are increasing my dividends. Carry on. The other advantage of being a shareholder in BrewDog is that whenever I go there, I get reduced rates on pizzas and reduced rates on beer. So, that's good. And the capital value's gone up no end. So there we are. Now, perhaps I try and better be a little bit more sensible and stop making silly remarks. So I'm going to tell you, because this is a wide audience and some people won't know anything about company law, I'm going to just talk to you about what company law is so that you have some idea. And basically, it's about the regulation of money and power. And it's a constantly shifting balance between the interests of the state, investors, that's shareholders, lenders, and directors and creditors. And it's like running a university. All these things are going at different things, and sometimes one is more important than the other. And you try to get a perfect balance, and it never works. And company law is a very, very practical subject. And from an academic point of view, this is a slight disadvantage, because in academia, you're supposed to go around finding theoretical underpinnings, because that's what makes it look good. And actually, there are no theoretical underpinnings for company law. Companies exist because Parliament passed Acts of Parliament to say that they exist. There's no theory, it's just practice. It's a very, very pragmatic subject. And so we don't have theoretical underpinnings at all. We have some principles that underpin company law, but they're not really theories. And quite a lot of those principles derive from accounting practice, and some of it derives from common sense. But basically, as I said, companies only exist because Parliament set up a mechanism for allowing them to exist. And companies are an artificial construct, and they have no physical presence. You could almost say they're a legal fiction, which we all have to live with. So that's what they are. Now, I've been practicing, teaching, researching, and writing about company law for over 30 years, and I feel like one of these academics who knows more and more about less and less, which is a familiar problem in our world. But what I like about it is that it requires a knowledge of many other areas of law, such as property law, a little bit of criminal law, business law, taxation law, finance and accounting. So you need a lot of these things. But at the heart of companies are people. It is people who make them run. And so when I teach my students the law, I always try to remind them, although it is an intellectually challenging subject, it is ultimately about human beings, many of whom are perfectly sensible. But the ones who feature in the courts and in the court cases that one reads tend to be vain, greedy, foolish, delusional, despotic, and sometimes sad. And that's the way it goes. Now, at the heart of company law is the, if I can get this to work, is the fact, oh, wait for it. Have I got it the wrong way up? No? Could I have a little bit of help, please? Technology is obviously quite beyond a corporate lawyer.
No, you're right.
It's not you, Nicholas. It is the system. It doesn't work.
You sound like Liz Truss when you say it is the system.
I'll just move them on for you.
All right.
Glamorous assistant.
Yes, this is my glamorous assistant. This is what was that conjurer? Debbie McWhatnot.
Working there.
Yes, okay, so I press this one. Okay, now to go back, at the heart of company law is the fact that nobody wants to go bankrupt. Now, I don't suppose many of you know very many bankrupts, but professionally I've come across a few bankrupts. And earlier today we were hearing from David, something from David Copperfield about Mr. Micawber. And this is the Marshalsea prison, which is where Charles Dickens' father was imprisoned. It's Marshalsea is in London, and there's nothing left of it except a wall. And if you've read Little Dorrit, or indeed one to other novels by Dickens, you will know that the threat of being bankrupt was a very severe one, and people had to stay in the Marshalsea for up to 20 years. And the only way you could get out as a debtor, because it was a special debtor's prison, the only way you could get out is if your family went out to work. And they would eventually pay off the debt, but you had to pay your maintenance while you were in the hospital, the prison, not so much the hospital. And of course, in Little Dorrit, the hero or the father manages to inherit a lot of money and come out of it. But it was no fun having to live this sort of way. Now, if instead of being in London, someone had had the good wit to go to Edinburgh to be bankrupt there, you could take sanctuary in this building, which you may or may not recognize, but it is just hard by Holyrood Palace and the ruined abbey. And this was the debtor's sanctuary. It's now a bit of a tat shop. It's one of those shops where you say, you go in and you say your name, and they say, we have your tartan, or that sort of place. And selling little Highlanders, toy Highlanders and things like that, and scarves. But it was the debtor's sanctuary, and if you stayed in there, you'd be quite safe and you couldn't be imprisoned. And you were allowed out on Sundays, because in Scotland, of course, nobody worked on Sundays, so you were allowed to walk around the city on Sunday, but on the rest of the time you had to live in there. So being bankrupt is not much fun. And this is why company law is, why, as I shall explain, is important. And so nobody wants to be bankrupt, and yet many people want to be rich, or at least be comfortable, and many people want to run their own businesses. But the problem with running your own business is that it only takes a few bad decisions or an unexpected disaster and your business collapses, and you may not have enough capital to keep on going. And history is full of famous bankruptcies. So I'm just going to show you one. This is the Darien adventure. Have you heard of the Darien scheme, which was where a whole lot of people in Scotland, round about the it says 1729, it was during the 1720s, they decided they were going to have a colony quite close to Panama, and it was a severely malaria-infested area, but they thought they were going to have a great trading venture. And it was an absolute disaster because the English wouldn't trade with them and nobody else would. And it was full of insects and many people died. And a huge amount of money was put into this venture and it wiped out a quarter of the nation's wealth and indirectly led to the Act of Union. I appreciate that this is dated 1729. This is a map from slightly afterwards. But a lot of people lost their money because of this. And another famous bankrupt is Sir Walter Scott. I hope you've all read his novels, but I bet you haven't. And Sir Walter Scott was a partner in the publishing firm Bannatynes that published a lot of children's novels and so on, and unfortunately it went bust, and he had to spend the rest of his life paying off the debts. And he was so successful at doing this that halfway through, all his creditors got together and said, "Thanks so much, it was really decent of you to go and produce all this money, writing all these books and plays and poems and so on. Here's a big silver set." And they did. They gave him a whole lot of silver plates and silver cutlery as a thank you, which, if you think about it, had been funded by him. Kind of strange, but there we go. And then later on, other famous bankruptcies in Scotland were, and this was the City of Glasgow Bank. This was in 1878, and that ruined an enormous number of shareholders, including an ancestor of mine. And there was fraud and all sorts of things that went wrong, and that was very distressing. And some of you may also have friends or connections who were not partners, who were names at Lloyd's, which meant that they were the ultimate underwriters at Lloyd's. And when Lloyd's went bust between 1998 and 2002, a whole lot of the names who had thought that they were just going to have a great income for life suddenly discovered that they were personally responsible for the debts arising from asbestos in the States. And a lot of people were bankrupted, and I'm sorry to say that actually some people took their own lives because of the awfulness of becoming bankrupt. So it was not funny at all. So what we need is some sort of mechanism whereby you can be involved in a business, but you don't lose everything if it all goes wrong. So we need to set up a special type of business vehicle that will allow you to do that. And it's got to be designed in such a way that it protects the honest and sensible, but it can't be taken too much of advantage of by the deceitful and devious. Well, if you're going to set up something like that, you need to have a stable political and economic structure and a mechanism for setting up such things. Unfortunately, in the UK, we do. And so we have actually had companies since Elizabethan times. I appreciate Queen Elizabeth I didn't reign in Scotland, but that's when they first started coming in. And the Stuart monarchs were very keen on them as well. And they set up all sorts of famous companies which are still going strong. The Hudson Bay Company, if you heard that, in Canada, and it was set up to bring back pelts from beavers. It was very, in those days, fashionable people wore special hats made out of beaver fur, and that's and it's still going to this day. The Hudson Bay Company, it's still a trading company in Canada. And the next one that I have up here is the Honourable East India Company, which was a great trading venture and was particularly useful in Scotland, but because all the younger sons of lairds in Scotland, who would obviously never inherit anything, used to join the East India Company, and then they could become what were known as nabobs, which meant they made a fortune and restored the family finances. And so other famous companies that were set up by either the Crown or by the Parliament were or the Royal Bank of Scotland and indeed the Bank of Scotland. Now, not all these, here's some officials of the East India Company having rather a good time. I thought you might enjoy the fact that there they are, based out in India, surrounded by dancing girls. These dancing girls, a little useful word for you, they're called nautchies. There's a dancing girl. And they're the two British gentlemen, and you see, look at them, they're beautifully dressed in sort of Regency clothes. It must have been absolutely sweltering in India. And this chap is smoking what some of you might call a hubble bubble, but it's strictly known as a hookah. And they're clearly having a very good time, and there's some musicians in the background. So I just thought you might enjoy that slight diversion. Now, the most famous or infamous of all these trading companies was the South Sea Company. And its real name, joyously, was the Governor and Company of the Merchants of Great Britain, trading to the South Seas and other parts of America, and for the encouragement of the fishery. Great name, isn't it? Really trips off the tongue. But otherwise known as the South Sea Company, which was set up to exploit the slave trade in South America. And it was a famously fraudulent enterprise, and it ripped off an awful lot of people, but the clever ones managed to sell their shares at the top of the bubble. There was a lot of speculation in the shares. Everybody kept buying the shares and talking the share price up, and up and up and up it went. And when the share price was really high, the directors sold their shares and disappeared. And it was discovered that it had almost no assets whatsoever. And it's a classic example of speculation going wrong. And it was one of many similar companies at the time. It was very fashionable to have those one. There was a special company set up for the fattening of elephants, goodness knows why. And another company was set up, and the director said, we're not going to tell you what it is at the moment, but we'd like to have your money for it all the same. And amazingly, people subscribed for it. So after the collapse of the South Sea bubble, we had, there was an act passed to try to prevent future speculative behavior. But this actually had the restrictive effect on commerce, and it was decided it wasn't a very good idea. So eventually, it was decided at parliamentary level something had to be done. We had to set up what was happening a little bit in other countries elsewhere. And in 1844, the Joint Stock Companies Act was passed, and in 1855, the Limited Liability Act was passed. And what these did is that they set up for the first time what underpins our company law now, a registration system for companies. So all companies have to be registered either in Cardiff or in Edinburgh or in Belfast. And there were requirements to lodge certain documents every year which would be open to the public, and anyone can go and find details about the company. The second act, the Limited Liability Act, introduced the idea of limited liability. Now, we talk about a limited liability company, but what it actually means is that the shareholders' liability is restricted to the amount that is unpaid on their shares. So most shares are denominated in a sort of fake value or nominal value of £1. Now, if you paid all 100 pence for your share, each share that you have extinguished your liability to the company. If the company goes bust later on, you don't have to worry about it because you paid your 100 pence. If you had paid, say, 20 pence for your share, your liability would be 80p, but once that's paid, you have no further liability. So do you see, it's the member or shareholder's liability that is limited. It's not the company itself. Anyway, this is, as you can imagine, a great advantage, because that means if you're investing in a business and it goes bust, you know in advance the worst thing that is going to happen to you. If you put £10,000 into a limited liability company and it goes bust, you know you're going to lose your £10,000, but you can budget for that. You're not going to be responsible for anything else. And of course, this is a wonderful safety net, and it encourages people to set up businesses which they wouldn't otherwise do. And it encourages research and technology, and it indirectly makes a nation's economy prosper, and it creates an employment, and out of employment and all these things, taxes can be paid. And indeed, many people think one of the reasons that Britain did so well in the 19th century is partly because we did have a well-developed corporate law system. And it's not just the setting up of new businesses, new trading ventures and so on, it encouraged the development of new forms of finance. And this is a picture of somewhere you may conceivably recognize. Do any of you recognize that slightly dingy looking building? It is the Alliance Trust. The Alliance Trust. And the Alliance Trust is where huge sums of money are invested by special boffins, or mainly analysts and so on, who specialize in trying to find the best possible place to put their investors' money to get the biggest return on it. And it's a long-standing Dundee firm, and it's extremely successful. It's also been in the news recently. I don't know if you've been reading in the financial press, but it's changed its fund managers. But it is a very successful business. And until limited liability was set up, we didn't have companies like this. Now, what happens with limited liability is not that the risk of trading unwisely goes away, but that the risk, instead of being with the people who set up the business, is transferred to the creditors. So how do creditors mitigate their risk? Well, there are various things they can do. They can look at the company's published accounts and say, well, does this look good? Should I stick with this company? They can look at the accounts of any other company that has the same directors, because if they can see that the directors have made a mess of lots of other companies, it's kind of a suggestion, don't invest in that one, or don't deal with that one. They can ask for personal guarantees. But you know, most of the time, when most of us deal with companies, we don't go and check their accounts, do we? You know, if you got a tradesman to come and do some work, you know, a plumber, there was a limited, would you actually bother to look? Well, Annalisa says she wouldn't. Some people would. But most people don't bother because life is too short.
I'm a lawyer.
So we, in a sense, we willingly take that risk, and it's not surprising we do so. But the thing is that although some creditors can mitigate their risk in the way that I was mentioning, 3 particular creditors cannot. And the first one are known, at least in England, as tort victims. A tort victim is someone who is subject to a negligent act by a company. So if it was a haulage company and one of their trucks runs over a little girl, the little girl is a tort victim. You see, she didn't want to be run over. She didn't negotiate a price for the damages in advance of being run over. She just suffers it. She's what is known as an involuntary creditor, and she can't do anything about that. So those creditors, such as the little girl, are not in a good position. The revenue is not in a good position. It has the laws are laid down for the revenue, but it too is an involuntary creditor, and it can't mitigate its risk by looking at the accounts or anything else. It just demands its money, and the money may not be there. And the third one is the environment. And so if a company, that, say an oil company, goes bust and it causes a great deal of pollution or whatever, then who picks up the tab? Well, the answer is we do, because there may not be enough money in the company. And actually, this is one of the looming problems for company law, is that our British company law, as it stands at the moment, and our current accounting practice, is not well geared up for long-term environmental liabilities. I mean, talking about 20-year liabilities, things that may not be evident now, but will be a problem in the future. There are other jurisdictions where they're doing something about it. And as an example of a long-term liability, this is a bing in West Lothian. Now, some of you may not know this lovely Scots word bing, but a bing is basically a hill made of detritus from former mining operations. And particularly in the West Lothian and 1 or 2 other places, there was a lot of shale, which is a type of rock that contains paraffin. And so the rock was quarried up and then was treated in various ways, and the paraffin would come out. But the shale, the remains of it, had to go somewhere. So back in the 1840s, when making paraffin was very popular and so on, they just made big lumps of this, and we are still having to deal with it now. This is our mess that we have to live with, that was put up there 140 years ago, whatever it was, and at the time they just didn't care. They said, we're dumping our problem on the future, or in the future. And of course, the shale companies have gone bust, and we still have to look at these rather unsightly things. You may have noticed that some bings have actually been landscaped recently. There are some that now have got nice greenery all over them. There's a rather spooky one on the main road. If you're getting the main road back to Edinburgh from Dundee, there's a spooky one with a little sort of antennae. And do you know that one? I always think there are Martians inside it. But, you know. So anyway, So this is a bit of a problem. Now, it's not just creditors who have a problem, it's the investors have a problem, and it's what is known as the agency problem, because how can you be sure that the directors are always have your best interest at heart? And the answer is you can't. And this was well stated by Adam Smith, who, as you know, came from not very far away, and he came from the fair city of Kirkcaldy, sometimes known as the Langtoon. Do you remember? Do we have anyone from Kirkcaldy here? Oh, yes? And you're admitting to it. Anyway, Adam Smith made the immortal, well, you can see it there. He basically said you can't necessarily trust the directors. They're not going to watch over the money with the same anxious vigilance with which the partners in a private co-partnery frequently watch over their own. Like the stewards of a rich man, they are apt to consider attention to small matters as not for their master's honours. So it's a lovely phrase, isn't it? Anyway, the small matters range from not always acting carefully to believing themselves, because of their status, entitled to certain privileges at the investor's expense, irrespective of the investor's views. And that's quite a familiar problem, that directors sometimes see their companies as a private fund of money that they can milk as much as they like, and it's tough on the other shareholders. And on top of that, another problem, not just an agency problem, is that some directors make a right mess of what they're doing. And here is a lovely Bateman cartoon and it's showing the chairman of the board of a company being ushered or forced to go and meet the baying shareholders. You can see they're looking very upset indeed, and he's looking very anxious at having to tell the terrible results that he's been doing. I thought you might quite like that cartoon, but you didn't seem very impressed, but there we go. Now, leaving aside directors' behavior for the time being, probity is a real issue. And the thing is, there's nothing quite like a company for the carrying out of fraud. And I'm always very interested in fraud, to the point that when I used to teach at Edinburgh University, they used to call me Dr. Fraud, because I found it so interesting. But fraud is very interesting. And I always tell my students how to carry out frauds, not because I want them to carry out the frauds, you understand. It's just so as they know to be careful in case anybody else does, and they can see what's going on. So let me tell you some of the frauds you can do. For example, you can set up a company with bogus directors. I had a friend who set up a company and the two directors were his children's pet rabbits. And a comedian a few years ago set up a company with Saddam Hussein and Adolf Hitler as the directors. Company's house never noticed.
Students here. It's just, they are students here.
Yeah, well, they know this. So in fact, they're going to introduce verification procedures in the future. So I would quite enjoy seeing the person who's going to be Adolf Hitler being resuscitated and having to, anyway, leaving that aside. So another rich source of fraud is a company's accounts. And one simple point is that you have to, in a private company, you have to render the accounts within 9 months of the company's financial year end. So if you wait till the very last day, that's a huge period of time, and you've no idea as a creditor what's been going on in the company in the meantime. And on top of that, if it's a small company, you only need to publish a balance sheet. And again, if it's a small company, it's not audited. So you're taking the director's words that the accounts as presented are true, and you've no way of knowing whether they're true or not. And even quite respectable companies sometimes cannot resist the urge to fiddle the accounts. Tesco recently, you would think Tesco would know better, but a few years ago Tesco had to settle a claim from disgruntled shareholders because Tesco had been overstating its sales figures and taking profits ahead of actually genuinely realizing them. And you would have thought someone would say to corporate governance, someone would say, this is not a good thing to do, but the senior management was so driven by the desire to achieve certain bonuses and keep the share price high that they did this fraudulent thing. And the next slide is of Carillion. You've probably heard of Carillion, that went bust not so long ago. And Carillion was spectacularly badly run. It woefully underfunded its employees' pension scheme. It did everything to make sure that the directors got their bonuses, even if nobody else did. It blacklisted contractors. It wouldn't pay people, and significantly understated its debts. So you could not rely on its accounts at all, and it had terrible corporate governance. And I think this picture is really good, actually. There it's trying to look important in Carillion. We've got a nice logo, and then this really tatty banner underneath. And Carillion was asked to build the tramway in Edinburgh from along Leith Walk. And they were very, very dilatory about it and made quite a mess of it. And in the process, they dug a large hole for some reason. I don't know why. And there the hole stayed for a long time. And eventually the people in Leith Walk thought, oh, this is ridiculous. It's been there for a long time. So they decided to have a birthday party for the hole. And they got some children turn up, and they got balloons and crackers, and they gave it a birthday card, and some people baked some cakes and so on. And they put up ribbons. And of course, Carillion employees came along, and when they heard of this, and they immediately started puncturing the balloons and knocking down the decoration, which was just terrible publicity for Carillion, as you can imagine. So there we are. Now let me tell you about another good fraud, which is insider dealing. I haven't actually done this, but I know very well how to do it. And the thing about insider dealing is that you take advantage of secret information that other people don't have, and you trade on the benefit of that information before the information is made public. But one of the defenses is that if you are accused of it, you can say, but the information is in the public domain. So what you do, this is a little tip for the future, is that as you do your insider dealing, at the same time you release your information, the secret information, onto one of these online financial communities, you know, like the Reddit communities, where you put the information there, and then if anyone challenges you, you put it under a false name, obviously, and if anyone challenges, you can say, but it's in the public domain. It's quite hard to get around that one. Just a tip for the future for all of you. You know. I have your best interest at heart, you know. Now, another famous one is what is known as a Ponzi scheme. I don't know if any of you tried this. This is the famous Charles Ponzi. He really does exist. So some of the audience is getting a little overexcited here. So a Ponzi scheme was set up by an American investor trading in stamps, and he gave his name to this particular dodgy activity, but you probably heard of a more recent practitioner, Bernie Madoff. Does that ring any bell? He was the one who, wait for it, he made off with the money. That's not the joke. Because that's a dad joke, and we don't want dad jokes. No. Now, Bernie Madoff was running a Ponzi scheme. Perhaps I can explain to you what a Ponzi scheme. Ponzi scheme is where a company promises a very good return on capital, but the only way it can do that is by attracting new investors. So the money goes out to the current investors, but it's only funded by new money coming in from a new investor. And this is a great game to play. You can do it really well until one or of two things happen. One is that you run out of new investors. Oops, that's a bit of a problem because you can't continue paying dividend. The other is if there's a financial crisis and your current investors want to pull their money out because there isn't enough money to repay them in the first place. And that's what did for Madoff. And he seemed completely impervious. He had no sense of shame. He just thought all the people that he'd shafted deserved it. If they were that stupid as to invest in his company, that was their problem. I'm glad to say his wife didn't feel quite the same way. She was appalled by what she discovered her husband had done because nobody knew just how fraudulent he'd been. And she was so ashamed of his behavior that she went off and volunteered to work in soup kitchens for the poor in New York as a way of atoning for her husband's behavior. And he had two sons who were working in London as part of the London branch of it, and I'm sorry to say one of them was so ashamed that he took his own life. He just was appalled at having been associated with his father's activity. So I hope you get the general idea that, you know, that bad things happen with company law. Now, I've been talking about fraud, and fraud is a strong word, But company law tries to regulate a large part of directorial behavior, which doesn't amount to fraud, and tries to make directors behave sensibly, because not all companies are run by decent old boys like Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway, that you've probably read about in the financial press. So as part of the regulation of directorial behavior, since the passing of the Companies Act 2006, directors are required to have regard to various stakeholders. And I hope, oh, sorry, we've kind of jumped a gun. We'll come back to this. And they're supposed to uphold high standards of business conduct. And I'll put the precise wording up in the meaning. Now, this was put down in Parliament. Parliament said that company directors had to uphold high standards of business conduct. There's something wonderfully ironic about politicians, of all people, telling or imposing high standards of conduct on anyone, particularly in the light of recent things that have been happening. But there we are. Now, this is what happens in the UK. And the reason that we have these particular rules that I'm about to show you in more detail is that our current legislation is strongly influenced by the European approach to running companies. And the European approach to running companies is that you have to take account not just of the need to make money, but you take account of the wider societal impact of the company on everybody, as it were, on consumers, on society, on the community, on employees, and so on. You don't just go for the money. And the European approach is very much a reaction to the Chicago School of Economics approach, which is exemplified by the late Milton Friedman, whom some of you may have come across. For those of you who may not have come across him, Milton Friedman was a very cynical economist who basically believed that the government, whatever the government did, always made things worse. And secondly, that the only cure for all problems was pretty much the free market. And while sometimes he said some quite funny things, he also sometimes overstated his case. This is what he said about companies, and in the context of social responsibility. There's one and only one social responsibility: to use its resources, engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say engages in open and free competition. Now that's a very hardline approach, and he didn't actually say outright that anything that doesn't benefit shareholders is theft, but he came quite close to it. And this was quite a popular approach within the City of London and in many countries' economies. And it was a popular view, and it's a very easy view to have because, of course, it allows companies to be as selfish as they like. But at the same time, it was not a view favoured in Europe, nor by the Labour Party that was in power during the Companies Act 2006. And that is why our Companies Act has these things, which basically says that directors have to do the best they can for the company, but they have to have regard to all these various stakeholders. And the idea behind it is that if you do this, you will end up with slightly more responsible decision-making than you might have done otherwise. And in fairness, this is what well-run companies tend to do. So now, it's the further reason why this particular wording was introduced back in 2006 was that in the years leading up to 2006, there had been a number of financial scandals. And I'm going to briefly tell you, because time is marching on, about some of these. And I don't know if you recognize this, but this individual is Ernest Saunders. He was commonly known as Deadly Ernest because he was so good at sacking people, and he always looks absolutely miserable, and I suspect he had a limited sense of humor. But he was the one involved in the takeover of the Scottish company Distillers. And he managed to do this by an illegal activity which is called financial assistance, which is slightly complicated, so I'll try and explain it. What he arranged to do was to ramp the share price of Guinness. And in other words, he artificially engineered the talking up of the share price of Guinness shares. And the reason he wanted to do that was because he wanted to persuade Distillers shareholders to give up their own shares and receive Guinness shares instead. So the more valuable the Guinness share, the more desirable it would be. So he arranged for there to be a special fiddle or a special way of talking up the shares. So what he did was that he approached various very, very wealthy individuals and he said, would you mind buying shares in Guinness shortly before the close of the markets, the stock exchange? And if you do that, then in the newspaper the next morning, it will show there was a sudden surge of interest in the share price of Guinness, and the share price will appear to go up day after day if you keep on buying the shares. And of course, this is exactly what happened. If you do buy shares just before the close of day, then the share price goes up, and if you're a Distillers shareholder, you will say, oh yes, look, goodness me, the share price is going up. Let's just sell our Distillers shares and get these great Guinness shares that appear to be going up day by day. I mean, wouldn't you? Now, what is also really nice about these wealthy individuals is that having been asked to do this, some of them said, well, what's in it for us? Well, he said to one of them, or one of them said his price for this would be that if the takeover was successful, he would give that individual the concession for Gordon's Gin in North America. Wow, wouldn't that be great? And the others all got indemnities, which means that if the share price fell, Guinness would make good the loss. Well, I don't know about you, but I'd quite like to be able to buy shares from a company and then be told by the company, it's all right, son, we'll give you the money back. Wouldn't that be great if it all goes down? So he was eventually caught doing all this, and he was sent to prison for this and other offences, and he absolutely hated the prison. Now, he went to Ford Open Prison. I hope none of you end up in an open prison, but there is one quite near here. It's called Castle Huntly, should you ever end up there. And he went there, and here, of course, the worst thing about an open prison or white-collar prison is that it is incredibly boring being in prison. This is one of the worst things about it. And he got so miserable that he went to his doctor to get pills for depression, and then he managed to persuade the prison doctor that he was suffering from dementia. Now, I may say that it is well known that you will not be sued for defamation if you call Ernest Saunders a liar, because it was conclusively proved in the various court hearings that he was a liar. So I'm not in any danger when I say he had a lying tongue inside him. He persuaded the prison doctor that he was suffering from dementia. He applied to the Court of Appeal to be released on medical grounds. And he was then in due course released. Now, I told you he'd made his contribution to law because he really helped define the whole business of financial assistance for the purchase of shares, which had not really been explored before. He also made a unique contribution to medical history because once he came out, he became a director of Carphone Warehouse and a director of a credit card company. And as I said, his contribution to science is that he is the only person known to have made a recovery from irreversible brain damage, which is... Now, my next character you may also have come across, Robert Maxwell. Do you remember him? Captain Bob. Some of you may recall his daughter got in a spot of difficulty. Ghislaine, I'm not going to go through that. And Robert Maxwell stole a whole lot of money out of the Mirror Group pension fund, and that caused it to collapse, and many pensioners died without ever getting their pension, which was a pretty dreadful thing to do. And the trouble was nobody ever dared stand up to him. As you can see, he was a huge man. He was 6'4" and he was 19 stone, and very scary. I mean, he had a ferocious temper. Nobody dared stand up to him. And it was really very unfortunate, the various things that he did. Nobody did stand up to him, but now, under the Companies Act 2006, we have provisions that would allow a brave shareholder in the pension fund to actually bring proceedings against the likes of Robert Maxwell if he did that sort of, well, if he were able to do it, that sort of thing again. So that was his contribution to company law. Do you get the general idea that these are the bad boys that are improving company law? Here's our next set of bad boys. In America, this was Enron. Some of you may remember Enron. Enron was a fantastically successful company in the States, selling electricity futures and paper and fiber optics and all sorts of things. And although it was profitable, they were up to all the financial tricks you can possibly manage. And in particular, what they were good at was hiding losses in partnerships which technically under American accounting rules didn't need to be included in consolidated accounts. What we do in the UK is that if you have a company, lots of subsidiaries, however they're constituted, you have to bundle them all together in what are known as consolidated accounts, and then you can see what the true financial position of the overall creature is. But they were hiding their accounts, and under American accounting law, it was not exactly illegal, but it certainly wasn't transparent. Well, eventually a whistleblower was so disgusted by the appalling things that they were doing that they blew the whistle and the company collapsed. And these two were due to go into court for all their various frauds, and Kenneth Lay managed to have a fatal heart attack a couple of days before he went to court, which must have been quite convenient for him. And Skilling, the other one, I think got 6 years in prison. Now, the effect of this, it was so bad, the things that he'd done, that the decided something needed to be done about it, and they passed what is known as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and Sarbanes and Oxley were the two senators who pushed it through. And this dramatically improved the quality of corporate financial reporting and the standards of company law, because previously the legislature and all the accounting requirements had been, as it were, captured by big business. And big business had said to the politicians, we want our accounting rules to be drawn up in the way that suits us, never mind the investors or creditors. And nobody queried this, but eventually they decided something must be done. And the something that had to be done was this act that has been transformational in improving the quality of American reporting. So again, bad boys doing good. And now we come to someone a little more familiar in Scotland. This is Fred Goodwin. And I can't pretend that he actually made a change to company law per se, but what he did do is that he set a new low in the annals of corporate governance. I think we could all agree on that. And you may recall that he effectively wiped out RBS, and it's because he had too much power. He was in too dominant a position, and he was a pretty strange individual. Have you heard about the filing cabinets at the Royal Bank of Scotland? He had an obsession with tidiness, and he discovered that in the headquarters in Goodwin or whatever it was, that some people had the temerity to leave pieces of paper on filing cabinets, and that was untidy and messy. So he insisted that all the filing cabinets had to have domed roofs, or domed tops, so that you couldn't leave pieces of paper. You know, there we are. Anyway, he, as you probably all know, came to grief. But of course, he features in lots of studies of how companies. And now we come to another familiar person. You remember this, Sir Philip Green? And he didn't make a great job of running BHS. He finally had to sell it for £1, which, considering what he paid for it, is a bit surprising. And he absolutely milked it for dividends, which were paid to his wife's company in Monte Carlo. Do you remember all this? And the glory of that is that there was no tax payable back in Monte Carlo. And so he was able to extract huge sums instead of doing more sensible things like keeping the pension fund topped up and so on. And so he didn't do the company a great deal of good. And eventually it was made clear to him that he'd better do something about the pension fund. So do you remember he put something like £250 million of his own money back into the pension fund? Well, of course, the threat was that if he didn't do this, he would lose his knighthood. And of course, Fred Goodwin did lose his knighthood. So my personal recommendation, were I Prime Minister, is that all captains of industry should be given knighthoods for the express reason that you could threaten to take them away if they didn't behave. Now, what is noticeable about many of these individuals is that none of them was exactly starving. They're already wealthy people, but they were risk takers, and they were people who seemed to think that the rules didn't apply to them. They also seemed to have a slender concept of shame. They didn't seem to mind how badly they behaved, and there seemed to be a certain contempt for what you might call the little people, like employees. And I don't know if you've come across the literature on corporate psychopaths, but you have. Yeah, but there is a certain amount of interest in the fact that some of the, particularly men, and that's why I said bad boys, who get to the top of large organizations, do appear to lack certain empathetic skills. And maybe that's what makes them get up to the top. And of course, the irony is that having got there, they are sometimes quite good for the share price. You know, Fred Goodwin was quite good for the Royal Bank of Scotland share price. The trouble is it tends not to last. Having a corporate psychopath at the top is quite good if you want to boost the short-term value, but long-term value, not so much. You know, but there we go. Right, now company law has to keep adapting. 180 years ago, when company law was introduced, directors could get away with almost anything. And now it's increasingly the case that directors are finding, or there are more occasions when directors will be found liable. And right at the moment, we've all been talking about the post office scandal. I think we're going to hear there are going to be repercussions of this that are going to change the law relating to directors' liability. And probably one of them is that there are going to be clawback provisions, which is what they have in other countries, which is where directors have to reimburse whoever has suffered out of the money that they were paid when they were directors. It sounds good, but the problem is that it's a drop in the ocean. You know, if you went to Paula Venables and said, okay, so you earn 300,000 a year for 10 years and so on, A, she might have spent it, or B, she might go bankrupt anyway, and even if you did get some of it, a lot more money is required than getting money out of the directors. But it is a step in the right direction, and it might concentrate some directors' mind. Now, other matters relating to changes to company law, and this is true of many other types of law, like taxation law and employment law, is that despite what politician thinks, there are very few cost-free changes. Because in company law, and this is particularly true in liquidation, if you benefit one particular cause, it always comes at the expense of somebody else. It's what is known as a zero-sum gain. And talking of taxation law, this is the moment for the joke. Now, are you ready? Are you braced? It was penned by someone called Swift. Whoops, that hasn't come back. What's happened? This one. Yeah, sorry, I meant to show you it's not this Swift. This Swift seems to be having a certain problem with her love life. Have you read about that? All her blokes seem to be not very nice to her. Boo-hoo. But anyway, it's not that Swift. It's this one. Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift, who was the 18th century satirist who lived in Dublin. And he wrote, as you hope you've all read, Gulliver's Travels. And he said about tax, there should be a tax paid by men on their attractiveness to women, but it should be on a self-assessment basis. Do you like that? So, was it worth waiting a whole hour and a half for? So, I indicated that the final part of my talk would be about the increasing similarity of company law throughout the world. And it is true, most companies, they are pretty similar. There are different things in different countries. In Germany, they have two-tier management systems. Some countries, you don't need to disclose anything, so you can hide your drug money there. In other countries like Delaware, there are lots and lots of companies founded in the state of Delaware, partly because there's nothing else to do in Delaware, and also because they have it's very director-friendly company law legislation. Australia it's actually well renowned at the moment because I was just speaking to someone about Australian company law, and they are very attuned to environmental matters. And I've just discovered recently that law in the United Arab Emirates is also quite thoughtful law, it's company law, because of the requirement under Islam to act charitably, which includes the community and so on. So they are really quite, or their law at least, is quite civilized in this matter. But it's not just law, company laws that are similar. It's all very well having a company law that is similar. You've got to have a legal system that is relatively fair. And unfortunately, there are some countries in the world, and they tend to be the more authoritarian ones, where they may have a reasonable company law system, but the judges always find for the home team, as you might imagine. So if you're not going to get a fair hearing, you tend not to want to invest there. But nevertheless, the advantage of similar laws, rather like having similar accounting system, is that we are all broadly working from the same set of rules. The details may differ, but the outlines are the same. And this is good for trade, and it's good for international relations, for investment, and for prosperity. Now, as for the future, something all company lawyers are going to have to deal with is the use in a good way of artificial intelligence, which we were talking about earlier today at noon. And you may have heard of the term boilerplate in contracts, but in a boilerplate in typically a property lease or something is pages and pages of standard documentation that always has to be there, but is mighty boring to read. And so the same sort of thing applies in corporate conveyancing in companies, that there is a certain amount of boilerplate. And AI is quite good at drafting that, and it's also quite good at spotting if someone is trying to put something sneaky in. Do you see, that wouldn't normally be there? You can say, and the AI is perhaps more likely to pick it up than a human eye. There may be benefits from that. What AI is not so good at for company is bespoke documentation, stuff that has to be specially drafted, because AI can only learn what's already in the public domain, and it's not very good at generating absolutely new ideas. And as we were talking about this morning, at the moment, it's not very good at judgment. Though there are certainly some areas where I think it will be quite useful, and particularly in litigation, because you can effectively plug in a series of problems, as it were, and they can look up in similar cases and say, right, this was the solution. And you could also do it with criminal matters. If you think about it, you could say someone was accused of driving at a certain speed in certain types of road, and then it'll just come up on the internet. Yes, there have been several other cases like this, and they've all given this sort of a sentence. So we expect that there will be benefits of AI, but at the moment, the problem is that it is a little bit unreliable. But a further place where it may be quite good is what is known as due diligence, which is when one company buys another, and the accountants and the lawyers then go in to look at the target company's finances and assets and documentation. And AI would be very good at scanning that to see if there was anything wrong with it. But as I said, AI is not very good at judgment, and that's why we have to continue to teach company law to each new generation. The computers can generate the paperwork, but it's the humans who have to carry out that difficult balancing act I was talking about earlier, between reconciling the interests of investors, creditors, lenders, the environment, the state, and the public. And that's the challenge for the future, and that's why it's so good to see so many students here, because they're the ones who are going to be taking this forward, and I have every reason, having taught them, that they will be well placed to do so. Now, I think that's about it, but I should just point out that normally lawyers normally bill by the hour, but as I've managed to do this within less than an hour, on this occasion I shall not be rendering a fee. Thank you all very much. But if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you very much. I think that's an excellent lecture. That's why the students really love you. I don't think we need